Hello.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being back with us at our discussion today about GDPR. We have a special guest that is outside of EUCI, but of course we have also Vyara here that you know very well, and especially the ones that are following us. So just in case, I'll make an introduction very shortly and then of course give the guests to introduce themselves as well. My name is Marina and I'm from the European Crypto Initiative. We do these talks monthly or even more often lately to discuss the most important topics when it comes to the European crypto regulation. And in this case, we also give you the opportunity to ask around, all the topics that we discussed or even more. At the end of this discussion, on the end of this interview, we'll also have an opportunity to answer your questions. So you can just type them in on LinkedIn or on X, and then we'll do our best to discuss it. But as you have seen in the last, I would say weeks, mostly the last week, there's been a lot of discussion about the new GDPR guidance that is linked to blockchain. What does it mean? How does it affect our daily operations? What is, who are the in a way stakeholders that are mostly involved in this process, but also that will kind of have to look into the guidance. So those are all the questions that we're going to discuss today. And I'll give it to Vyara first, and then, of course, James.
Yes, thank you, Marina. It's really exciting to be on the other side of this LinkedIn Live, but that is also now an X Live. So don't forget to ask your questions on both platforms. So my name is Vyara. Some of you might already know me. I'm part of the EUCI for over 2 years now. I've been part of the EUCI. My focus has been predominantly on human rights previously, and now I'm focused quite a lot on also the privacy and blockchain issues that have always been there, but now have re-emerged with new strength. So happy to be here, happy to answer all your questions, and we will be steadily providing information about this in the next weeks as well.
Thank you very much, James. We are very happy you took the time to be here with us. Would be more very interested to learn more.
Thanks for the invite, Vyara and Marina. It's great to be here. I work at the Ethereum Foundation. I cover many different topics. Being British but based in Europe, I have a particularly strong desire to see some of the regulatory changes that are happening become good. I see Europe walking down a dangerous pathway, and I think that we can hopefully course correct. And I'm really glad that lots of people are willing to discuss this and talk about this in the open as well. And it seems like the technology moves so fast that when regulators are coming in and talking about putting regulations in, they're unaware that maybe this new technology actually solves a lot of the problems they're trying to tackle themselves. So that's something I'd love to unpack and discuss today as well.
Okay, that's great. Let's just dig deep dive deep into already. So let's set the context. What happened? I know that some of you had time to read the guidance. Some of you had time to read only the posts. Let's discuss what happened a few weeks ago. What did the European Data Protection Board issue? What does the guidance in a way mean? Does it have any legal effect? And I'll give it to Vyara first to start with this answer.
Thank you, Marina. Yes. So I would start by saying that finally those guidelines are out because it has been something that we as an industry have been waiting to happen for quite some time. And what it means and basically what those guidelines really are. This is the way that the European Data Protection Board, that is the EU level supervisor when it comes to data protection and privacy in the European Union, they are providing their interpretation of how the GDPR should apply in the context of blockchain infrastructure. So they are saying, yes, we have this infrastructure. Basically, that's in terms of a very brief overview of the guidelines. There is this infrastructure that we understand is technologically not aligned with the GDPR and the way rights and protection of privacy rights are listed and drafted, but we need to have the same level of protection no matter the technology. So that's it in a nutshell, which in a sense represents some of the greatest fears that the industry has had when it comes to how GDPR aligns or does not align with the infrastructure. And it has been, especially for people that are in the space for longer, lawyers in particular, it has been quite a heated discussion in 2017, 2018, when the GDPR first came along in full force. Basically, how do we align this technology that is not centralized? There isn't a centralized entity that controls everything, because you need that centralized entity under the GDPR. How do we even translate the GDPR in this context? And now, few years later, the European Data Protection Board came out with these guidelines, 25 pages, but quite packed, saying, yes, basically, you should not be using public blockchains for data processing. And whenever there are issues that you cannot resolve on a technical level, you might be required to also delete the blockchain. But the good thing, in a sense, is that this is still on a consultation, at a consultation phase. So we have until the 9th of June to respond, and at the very least provide the viewpoint of the industry of how this should be handled and how this should not be handled in this case.
From someone that's not from the policy world, can I ask a question about this? I see a lot of different initiatives creating these policy recommendations as a bit of a land grab for future jurisdiction control. Is that what's potentially happening here with GDPR?
So I wouldn't say that, because what's interesting is that the European Data Protection Board it's the supervisor. It's the same as with MiCA. We have had many discussions around what the European Securities Markets Authority is in relation to the European Commission. So we have the Commission and the other two EU bodies, the Parliament and the Council, that are the policymakers. So the GDPRs and the regulations of those kind come from these three institutions. And they will have the interpreters. Basically, those are the supervisors. And they are not necessarily aligned with whoever is holding the pen with the initial legislation. And with the European Data Protection Board in particular, there has been this very hardcore approach when it comes to to even understanding what personal data is. This is an ever-growing concept, which is quite problematic. And now we see it with the guidelines as well, where wallet addresses are also considered personal data. So we see this approach. And the other approach is they're very strict in saying, yeah, we don't really care that much about the technology you're choosing to use, as we care only about the law being followed strictly as it is. And all the concepts of pseudonymity, pseudonymization, encryption, they are already defined in the GDPR. So basically, if you're outside the scope of the things that can be done, it doesn't matter what tech you're using. So I would say it's not necessarily related to something broader in this context when it comes to just the European Data Protection Board. They are just very strict, not to use another term, in interpreting what the GDPR is and how it should be perceived in the context of blockchains.
Thanks.
Maybe in this regard, I would just add that it's really, in a way, interesting to see something that we have been discussing from the beginning, and something that I think is fascinates everyone that is working in this space, is this lack of centralized control that blockchain has. And now we see a very direct consequence to this. So the way how blockchain was designed is very unique, and we have not seen something similar in the past. Right now, there has been different, I would say, consequences to this, especially when we think about different laws. But here specifically, I think it's a really, really interesting use case if we think about the GDPR and blockchain, because it's really the lack of the centralized entity that can control these data flows that is something that is problematic within the design of the blockchain from the GDPR perspective, of course. So everything else that decentralized blockchains bring, and that is in a way security, etc., decentralization, neutrality, this is something that in a way the GDPR doesn't know how to deal with. And then just because GDPR was written before blockchain in a way was used widely as it is right now, the idea is we were there first. We didn't take in a way the systems into account, and this is what it's written right now. So you should comply with GDPR, and there's no room for interpretation in a different way when it comes to the existing GDPR draft that we have today. So basically, in a way, in a strictly legal sense, this is what we have, and this is how the European Data Protection Board is in a way describing they're seeing on how GDPR applies on blockchain. So what specifically is the biggest problem? It seems to be the paragraph 63. I think this is really the most extreme part of like the whole draft. And of course, it's not something that we would want to, in a way, scare you with. It's not something that will happen tomorrow. We'll discuss later on what are the consequences, etc. But what is paragraph 63 saying?
So yes, I will not go into the boredom of reading it to you, but the gist of it is that it's saying that basically if you are not technologically possible to make your chain compliant when it comes to the GDPR, which means deleting data from it, which also means, again, wallet addresses. So if that's not possible, it might be necessary to delete the whole chain plus the nodes coding copies of the chain. So in a way, they're saying, yes, if those issues cannot be rectified, even with technology that has been around for numerous years, then the only way out we see is the simple destruction of the chain and the problem disappearing with that, which unfortunately goes into a direct conflict with not just like the ideology of the crypto space, that's one thing, but also with all that the European Union, the European Commission, and the other co-legislators and supervisors have been doing with frameworks such as MiCA, such as the DOT pilot regime, where open permissionless blockchains have been quite allowed, so to speak, under this framework. So in a sense, the issue is not just with the interpretation itself, it's also with the effect that it would have on the whole framework and the security of the market participants and what we're even doing here as a community.
No, that's really the most important question. And I would also want to, in a way, ask James, here it's even in the GDPR, it was mentioned, the kind of a difference between the public blockchains and private blockchains. What are, like we're all in a way, when it comes to crypto assets, mostly using public blockchains. Those were really the first ones. This is why, we also think like this industry is fascinating. Maybe a little bit more about why it's so important that, in a way, blockchains are public and that we are allowing them to, in a way, be used in finance when it comes to other applications as well. But unfortunately, the GDPR somehow addressed, or in a way, it seems to be easier to be complied with GDPR when it comes to private blockchains. So we have this like difference here, and it also has a consequence on the compliance with GDPR.
So there's a lot of different directions I could take this in. There's a lot to unpack, but I will start off saying, I think a long time ago there was private and public blockchains, and it was you choose one or the other. It's now very gray, scale of 1 to 100, and private and public is now on a spectrum. With the technology advances that are happening, you'll be able to do everything on a public blockchain that you want out of a private blockchain. Hide transactions for privacy if it's something very sensitive, for example. In terms of the spectrum here, I think that's a level of education that everyone probably needs to, we need to keep growing as well. A lot of people have tried private blockchains. The Australian Stock Exchange spent $250 million building a private blockchain and they ended it. Microsoft spent millions building a private blockchain and they ended it. None of these companies want to write about ending these projects because it doesn't look very good. So there's not tons of information out there. So it feels like a lot of companies have had to go through this same process. And last week when I was in Zurich, I spoke to JP Morgan and a ton of other banks and central banks, and they all took away that they started understanding why public blockchains are there. One of the best reasons I usually say this to people is it's geopolitically neutral, ideally. It also means you're not playing on somebody else's turf. So I believe that there's a concern of who has control and where does the value go to on a public blockchain. Because actually, if I look at the internet, that captured zero value and was accepted by everybody because everyone knew that there was no costs associated with, oh, they're not going to like triple the cost on me overnight randomly. I'm stuck. Linux is in 98% of servers for this same reason. It's an invisible infrastructure that people can adopt. Ethereum, in my opinion, is a similar way to a lot of what the perfect blockchain would be, is it captures some of the value with its token, but it's not looking to maximize value as well. So a public blockchain is permissionless that anyone can build on, and parties can also interact with each other as they wish. And I think this is the big thing that a lot of players are starting to realize, is that if you want to do business, you need to be on an open public network for connecting to each other rather than wanting to play on somebody else's software. And I think they've all been burnt in the past, that they're starting to understand this situation as well. Does that give you was there any other questions you had around that too?
Yeah, I think there are two very important things. First, in a way, there are use cases already of public blockchains being used by institutions. There's like already, a lot of interest around that, and we are not seeing this going away. Mm-hmm. And second, it's really a simplification, saying this, application, this stack is built on public blockchain versus private blockchain, as you mentioned. Everything is kind of connected together. It's infrastructure that will be, bridged, work together, etc. And so, just as this complexity, when you think about like an application or a product, how could we even then look into the compliance of GDPR, besides the way of like trying to understand the difference between the application layer and, in a way, the layer one or the infrastructure, as you said, linked to something that we can use similarly to the internet. Many times when we wrote about decentralization, and we also wrote, responses and papers when it comes to DeFi, DAOs, etc., we mentioned that this infrastructure should be protected and, in a way, not regulated and not captured. And I think that even with regulations that we have discussed so many times, when it comes to crypto assets regulation, when it comes to anti-money laundering, etc., we kind of, at least from now and from our understanding, we have protected the layer one, the infrastructure, from being what it is and for not being limited or captured in a way that it would not be able to function the way it is. But now with the GDPR, this is where it stops in a way. I think it's like, in a way, also something that I wanted to add to your comment or ask further. What do you see the future? Where do you see the future being? Because this guidance, in a way, they're just published. So maybe there will not be a quick reaction immediately. Maybe we'll see something, or there will be debates in the next years. So let's say in 5 years, how do you see this ecosystem changing? And can something like this be? Then we'll discuss if something like this could be limited by the GDPR guidance, or could we, just try to interpret in a different way? Also later on discussing, ZK and other privacy tech.
Where do I think it'll be in 5 years? I think it's really difficult to say. From the conversations I'm having, though, everybody wants to now build on public blockchains. They realize the tech is not quite there for some use cases, but it is there for a lot of use cases. And it's something that I think is actively being worked on. So I actually see it being very viable that public blockchains work with some of the regulations coming in. Some of the regulations suggested in that document are extremely against the ethos of having an open ledger and an immutable ledger. So I do think there's a huge risk of something happening there, and a lot of the value leaving the European Union if rules like this come into place. I think it's also incredibly difficult for the European Union to monitor and control the situation as well, from what some of they're suggesting. I liken it to, there's a paper called the Digital Sovereignty Stack, and it talks about similar problem a lot of people are aware of. 90% of cloud computing in Europe is owned by Google, Microsoft, and Amazon. The biggest player in Europe owns 2% of the market share. And this is where I see all of that data lives outside of the European Union, and we're walking into a similar situation with new technologies like AI and blockchain. And I really want to see this turn around in a big way. Will this happen? Will the regulators listen? You know better than me on that one.
That's great. And just the last question, because it's so interesting. What you mentioned, most of the players want to build on public blockchain. Why? Like, where do they see the opportunities there, and why this is important and interesting for them?
A lot of them see composability, so they can interact with each other. This is why a lot of layer 2s and rollups make a lot of sense. Let's use the example of Deutsche Bank or Sony can have their own layer 2, and they can then choose who to interact with. But they have their own control, their own layer, their own rollup, but then they can interact, and it has the most liquidity to be able to interact with each other. So on a public blockchain, I see you being able to choose the rules of who you want to interact with or not. And you can also then do business across the world very easily. Whereas a private blockchain has a very limited growth spectrum as well. You also get, I've used the example of, say, Disney v. Netflix. If Disney built a blockchain, would Netflix go on it and cooperate? No, probably not, for obvious competitive reasons. So it would be two siloed private blockchains. But if there was a public one, they could choose in which way they wanted to interact with each other. And that's how I see, that's what I see businesses starting to realize as well. I'm actually talking to, there's a trio of European banks all launching something on Ethereum mainnet in about 3 months' time. And I think that's super interesting. They've chosen that route to go to, and they've chosen this so that they can plug into existing DeFi projects in the future as well.
That's super exciting. So let's go back to the GDPR. I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding, or maybe lack of interpretation or kind of explanation to why this is so important for the whole community, for the whole industry, and really directly for the blockchain. Because there's been this interpretation that, okay, in which case, in which application does maybe not or could not follow the GDPR rules. And what most of the people we have talked to had in mind was maybe something connected to one application, holding certain private data, plus, holding certain data that is on the blockchain, or putting this data on the blockchain, and this specific application or this specific organization having to comply with the GDPR. But it seems that there's much more, as we have discussed. There's a whole layer of infrastructure that is being put together whenever we want to, see a final result, which is an application at the end of the day. So there might be also different ways how we look at this stack layer from the GDPR perspective. And I wanted to ask Vyara a little bit more on why it's really something where we need to think about the blockchain layer, mostly as a community. And what's important in a way also, I would say, policy-wise, as I mentioned, is that the infrastructure layer stays neutral and stays as it is, because of course everyone else is building on top of it. So this is an interest of all of us. And why do we really need to think more on the deeper we go, the most important it is for us to kind of leave it as it is and make sure that somehow is compliant, or make sure that the guidance in the future or the GDPR would also change?
Yes, that's a great question. I would say those are great 10 questions in one, at least. But talking about the problem, starting with the problem that is focusing on the core infrastructure when it comes to solving this type of compliance issues, I really like this comparison with basically comparing this request to delete the blockchain with any possible request coming to delete the internet, basically, because there has been something wrong going on out there and something that is not quite compliant. I would say that the logic is the same. You don't go to the fundamental layer to solve something that, especially if it can be solved on a layer that is quite up. But with the GDPR, what is particularly problematic is the whole, I wouldn't say actually problematic, but what is currently causing the conflict is the whole concept that whenever there is data, personal data that is being processed, there need to be specific figures that are responsible for that. So you have the data controller, that is the key figure that determines how and why the personal data is being processed. And combining this with the fact that currently the scope of what personal data even is growing and growing. Whenever there is any type of, it doesn't even have to be reading or analyzing the data. Whenever there is any type of personal data exposure, there needs to be automatically a data controller and often even a processor and all these other functions that are determined by the GDPR. So this is where the problem really would occur whenever there is, for example, some future data breach, which again, in the context that a wallet address is personal data and a lot of other things might be also considered personal data. Data breach would also mean quite a lot of a very broad number of things. So whenever there is a future data breach and there needs to be a responsible person and determined out of all these people that are people and even smart contracts that are integrated in the data processing in this specific context, that's gonna raise the real question. Okay, who is actually the controller here? What do we say are those aims and how those decisions were made initially? So it's very likely that in practical circumstances, this would all boil down to the lower level, because to some extent, some things cannot be changed on an upper level, especially if we, and I'm adding a bit more complexity, I think, to this, but especially if we consider that all encrypted personal data is also personal data and need to be protected the same way as the original data. So whenever we are using any encryption mechanism, such as zero knowledge proofs, fully homomorphic encryption, even hashing, that data needs to be protected the same way as the original personal data, plus the data subjects, that's the person whose data that is, needs to be also informed, and there needs to be a reason for this processing and all of that. So the encryption itself does not solve it. So the encrypted data basically is still personal data and can be tracked down to the original data that is already visible somewhere on some of the lower layers. So I would say, quite a lot of problems, and as always, it's gonna be also the interpretation that would matter. But from the guidelines, we can already see where this is kind of headed.
Okay, so the most important thing, to summarize what you mentioned, it is important for us to understand that public and private, so in a way, anonymous and pseudonymous data is different. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit there as well.
Yes, that's a very important distinction, because particularly in the lingo that is being used, even in the crypto space, but not only, there is quite often the use of anonymity, anonymous data, for data that would not under the GDPR be considered anonymous. So we might be creating this sense of security in ourselves that is not quite there, because most of the time we're talking about an encrypted data, encrypted in some way data, which means automatically that it is deemed pseudonymous data under the GDPR, and pseudonymous data equals personal data. The anonymous data, we do have this category, but that is basically something completely useless from I would say, a practical point of view, because you can make no connection between that data and the original data subject. So even if you kind of change some names or hash some information or something like that, it would still not be anonymous, because it can still theoretically, and here it's very important that it's theoretically possible to be linked back to the person. Even they're saying in the European Data Protection Board guidelines, even at some future instances of future technological developments need to be taken into account, and all the current kind of state-of-the-art knowledge and technological abilities need to also be taken into account. So even if you cannot personally do this connection, if it's possible, if someone is already doing it, then it's considered as the norm.
They're considered by like, can an authority track you down by requesting an exchange release data about that address versus it's not publicly identifiable?
So it doesn't matter if it's not publicly identifiable. So the logic is that it can be identified. It doesn't matter if it can be identified by a specific person or entity. It doesn't even matter if you, as a data controller, theoretically speaking, know who this person is. If it's possible to identify this person, the data about this person is already considered personal data. So it's more about what can happen with the data. It's always about like the rights of the data subject. Again, the data subject is any EU citizen whose data is being processed. Processing is super wide as a concept. It's not about what you can or cannot do.
Yeah, so, but logically, anything like that is possible. So the logic doesn't make sense to me, but there you go.
There we go. It is, yes. So especially, and this is like an extra layer of complexion here, especially with all the tools we already have, all the analytics we already do on chain. Even if, say, 7 people can know who this wallet belongs to, if it's possible, that's it. That's enough.
So I think here we really came to the most important point. The data that most of the community think it's anonymous or might not be problematic under the GDPR, it usually is, or it might be in theory. So again, the public wallet address might be personal data. And if we think that the product is the blockchain, what is the chance that in any time in the past that we have used the blockchain, that thing could be connected to one person? It doesn't really matter on which application, on which exchange, or any other type of like NFT, wallet, NFT ticket systems, or any other use case. What is the possibility that this happened? It did 100% happen. And so thinking about the product that has to be compliant with GDPR, which is the blockchain, we do have quite a lot of certainty that this is a huge problem right now. And so just to recap what you mentioned, pseudonymous data is still regulated under the GDPR. The public address is and could be pseudonymous data, not in every case, but it could be. And then also the kind of zero knowledge proof and other techniques that you mentioned, they might not be enough for this data to become anonymous, and it still is somehow pseudonymous, at least in few cases. So this is where we are right now. And as we discussed, what the consequences are could be also the request for deletion, but also there was a kind of a discussion around who those data controls could be, who are the entities that might be needing to, in a way, comply with GDPR. Can you share a little bit more on this, Vyara?
Yes. So again, going back to the whole logic that the GDPR says, and the interpretation of GDPR by the European Data Protection Board and other competent authorities, NCAs, on the member state level, has always been that, yes, we need to have a data controller if we're having data processing. So based on that, then the logic is on the true roles that are being basically what you're doing with the data and who is deciding what. So even in the European Data Protection Board's guidelines, they're saying that it doesn't matter what you're calling yourself, and even if there is any structured relationship between the parties and things like that, what matters is what's happening and who is more or less, in some sense of the word, worth making the decisions about the processing. So in this case, they are pointing quite obviously towards nodes and validators, because especially whenever there is some decision making in terms of the order of transactions in the blocks that are being validated, they're saying, yes, in this case, you're already executing control. So in this case, you might be considered a joint controller. A joint controllership is basically when you have multiple controllers that use the same personal data or pool of data. And in this case, they're saying, yeah, there might be multiple validators, multiple nodes. So you will be, in some scenarios at least, joint controllers. Again, with the logic that there always needs to be a controller, a data, whenever personal data processing occurs. And from there, they're also going a bit deeper into, okay, how the importance of this tracking of basically your own responsibilities. And with all those guidelines, it's usually the same. There is some sort of a impact assessment, data protection impact assessment in this case, that you need to take into account whenever you're building or using something that has already been built. You need to evaluate also your role based on basically what type of control you have, what type of control you execute, who you're sending to, and what is going on with the data.
This is where it said you must justify your use of a public blockchain in one of the questions the data controller had to have, right?
Yeah, you must, exactly. So it's quite clear when you read the guidelines, even if you're not working on in the blockchain space full time, that there is a desire to limit the use of public blockchains, generally speaking. And there is this requirement mentioned quite a lot of times within the document, that you need to reconsider the need of this infrastructure because of the problems that it might cause from the data protection point of view, which to some extent is fair, especially considering the wide scope of personal data and the ever-growing scope of personal data. But also it should not be the European data protection's role to say what type of technology is being used, particularly when this technology is already integrated in also in the financial market of the European Union. So what they're saying is basically all that you have been building here is financial legislations and pilot regimes and sandboxes. It's simply not compliant. So you need to stop using this and stop innovation from happening. This is how it sounds.
I think the extent to this, it's somehow linked to how the blockchain is designed, how it works, what are the role of the nodes, etc., and certain other very important, like I would say, elements of the blockchain, and how does it work today, and how they are kind of in a way mathematically, technically collaborating on true software. But the other one is also, we talked about a lot about the differences between public and private blockchain. And also, like you just mentioned, the kind of the industry that we have in Europe, and how from the other institutions like the European Commission, it has been recognized that it is an important technology, that it is something that could help Europe in a way innovate and create jobs, etc. What would happen in theory if that would be, GDPR would be strictly limited? That's more like of a question for James. Like, if you have any type of like feeling to what is the percentage of like the applications or anything built within the private blockchain space versus public. I have a number in mind, but like I think it's also really hard to assess, because I don't think there's data around that. It's very clear for Europe.
For Europe specifically, wow. I think there's very small going on in private, and I would say, I don't know. What's your number? I have no idea how to predict this.
I'm like we can think about like how many tokens that are listed, like really simple example, how many tokens that are listed on exchanges are being issued on public blockchains?
Yeah, I mean, tokens or transaction volume, but there's obviously a mixed reason for the public ones, whereas the private ones, there's a lot of testing. They're still exploring, playing with it. There's obviously some private networks that are doing some transaction volume, like JP Morgan's one, though I think that's USA and Middle East focused. So I think it's very small in private blockchain world. There are some people acting on Besu, which is an Ethereum client. They do it on private blockchain. And there's quite a lot of activity in that space, but a lot of them tell me they would love to move public with the same. They're trying to work out control, privacy, KYC, the three big buckets that they want to solve, and then they would love to move to a public chain where they can start interacting with more projects and protocols, because they are siloed, and then you're in this thing where you have to convince your competitors to come and join your chain, and that conversation never goes down very well.
Okay, that's a great example. It's actually tapping into the potential and the ecosystem that is out there on the public blockchains, and basically being isolated or siloed if you are in ways trying to build or relate to something that is much smaller and that could scale much, I would say, harder.
I would go as far as to say, like, do you need a open ledger technology for some of the private blockchain initiatives currently going on? Like, is this needed? Because of the idea of the blockchain was that it's public, open, permissionless. If you start doing private, maybe there's some interesting use cases, but I think with the technology as it's currently progressing at the rate, let's say at the rate it's progressing, there will be no need for a private blockchain in the future.
And that brings me also to something interesting that we have seen a lot in the past, but I think it's coming more and more in the future, as there's more and more people that are coming to this blockchain ecosystem. They're trying to understand what's going on from the public and private side, but also the amount of retail that is joining. I think it's harder to do some sort of like education or understanding what is the difference between public, private, like what are all the basically interesting use cases, etc. How do you see this even like, assessment happening or education? Like, do we understand what is the difference, and do we understand in a way, do we know how to curate the information that we rely upon, when we are taking any type of decisions in this regard? Because what you mentioned in a way is there's a value in public blockchains, because private blockchains might have use cases, but in a way, there's similar technologies that we can use that are similar to a private blockchain. I mean, this is really just very cynical, but a lot of people just say use spreadsheet. Like, what is the difference if we have like in a way a centralized blockchain versus that you have like another centralized software? Like there might be differences, but it's not as different as from the public blockchain. So I feel like that many times we do hear certain players in the ecosystem using certain words that are more aimed for the marketing rather for the understanding of what and how the product works. And I think that whatever you see like a nice marketing slogan, you would need to have subtitles there and saying, oh, if you look at the code, this is how it works. And that's the difference from the other code that is used by the other in a way projects. Like, how do you see this like marketing with specific words versus how the product really works, and how to explain this to someone that is coming to this industry for the first time, for example?
I think it's challenging because it can get very technical very quickly, and then there's also disagreements about what makes a decentralized blockchain, what is not a decentralized blockchain. We've been thinking about me and Tim Baker have been thinking about building this world map of resilience. I think that's a a big point to understand of if each country shut down all the nodes of each blockchain, how long would each blockchain last? In terms of how globally resilient is it? How geopolitical neutral is it? Who can spin up a node and start running their own, so you then don't have to rely on anybody. You could push your own transactions through. If all the nodes suddenly switched off, but you were still running yours, is that allowed? There's lots of different questions you could ask around this, and I don't think anyone's actually defined a good set of questions for people to work through. And that's something that I think we should address, so they can come to their own conclusions about what is acceptable to them to use.
I absolutely agree. And I've seen, I think in the last year, more and more of those things. Like, I know that in the past, we were saying just put blockchain on it and, it will do magic and it's going to be marketed and it's kind of a marketing a trick. But I think it's more and more becoming something very important because of what we have discussed, the complexity of like these technologies even interacting with each other in a way when you want to ship a product, and then really subtle differences between layer 1, subtle differences between layer 2s, etc. If you think about it. So I think some kind of indication around that. I really do hope that you're going to have time and the opportunity to ship something similar. Great. So we could talk forever about this topic. I think we'll need at least like some 3 hours to expose all the questions that we have. But one thing that is important for us to think right now in this process is what to do. So we have the guidance, we have GDPR, we have different I would say there's different legal understanding, or at least there's different legal power in a GDPR that is a regulation already applicable for many, many years. And then we have this guidance that is for now just a draft. They're waiting for the replies. So this is also something that we are doing with EUCI. You can reach out if you have any questions or you want to contribute in any manner. So there's this path that is the policy path. And here we have questions. What is the best thing to do, and how to react, and what do we need to do? But then there's also kind of a technical one where we would need to, or would like to, understand more of what's happening, what is the innovation happening in the space when it comes to privacy, and could this in theory be interpreted of something that could be compliant with GDPR, or could we at least use that as an idea to basically propose maybe in the future to the regulator, look, this technology is evolving, it's used in a different way, maybe you should rethink your strict positions and maybe a middle ground here. And starting with this last part of the discussion, I also want to ask you, James, what do you see the latest developments when it comes to privacy tech and just privacy, of course, here on Ethereum, but I think it's just something that is a really, really strong trend in the last years.
So 2 things there. I think light touches are the way to go when we've got fast-moving technology. I can't believe that some of the proposals coming out globally, whereas actually nobody could be that certain, not even the people building it. And I think light touches allow for A, growth, B, a bit of regulatory clarity is never a bad thing for certain projects. And this is like a huge unlock that I think they're missing. So if they go to the full extent, it causes trouble because it stifles a lot of innovation of what you can and can't do. As the technology develops and grows, you can obviously add and refine to it, but I really think that the technology is moving at a fast rate right now, that it causes huge issues to be this draconian is the word I'll use. Now, to your second question, there's rather than going too technical, as tech is developing a layer 2, which is completely privacy focused. It has privacy focused on the user and the protocol side. So there's 2 sides privacy you can use. There's things like TLS Notary, more popularized now as TLS CK, which is transaction layer security. And with this technology, you can, for example, I can download a bank statement and send it to you and prove that I've not edited it on the way of after downloading it and sending it to you. And I can also redact any parts of that information that I want to as well. and prove that I've not edited it, I've just redacted parts. We built a proof of concept in India, such as a non-Aadhaar. So I'm saying it wrong, I think, but Aadhaar is a digital ID in India. But when you sign up to something, you have to give all of your information over. And a lot of the Indian citizens would like to just give the minimum available to say, not I'm 64, I'm over 18. And I'm now of the age where I'd rather someone knew I was just over 18 and not my actual age as well. So it would be super helpful. But there's a lot of good technology like this coming into place, which I think will continue to adapt. ZK Zinc has also got some good privacy tech as well. And so there's a lot of, there's obviously privacy pools, and I think some of this can work very well for enterprises. On layer 1, Ethereum, there's even some technology being built there, because previously all of the development has been on layer 2. So now we're looking at both options. So there is a ton of stuff coming, and we are really looking into more privacy work that I think will be in the next 12 to 24 months will change the landscape of blockchain as well.
This is very exciting. I'm looking forward to learn more about it. And now we go back to the policy questions. So policy, but also kind of the compliance questions. We have not seen much, I would say, many fines or any kind of enforcement coming from, from the authorities related to blockchain. And in theory, again, this guidance are interesting and then help us understand the relation with GDPR and blockchain, but the core regulation did not change. It's still there. So if it is, problematic today, it was problematic from the beginning of the existence of GDPR or the blockchain, whatever was first there. And so what can we do right now, explaining again, like what are the next steps when it comes to the guidance, but in the same way, what could be some kind of, consequences to this guidance. We don't want to be very, I would say, negative. I think we can really look into this somehow as an opportunity, but it is important to understand, where to go now. Without, I would say, looking into this as something alarming that you should do as a project or anyone building on blockchain today. I think it's important to understand that things are moving on both ends, as James said. There might be updates on the layer 1s. There might be updates also coming after the consultation on the guidance. But it is important for us in EUCI, of course, to follow this very thoroughly and to respond to anything that's happening. But I think that for the ecosystem, for the projects, just follow, and then you also know when there's going to be new developments happening on this, and I think we will have news in the next few months. So again, a question that has many questions in it, but I'm sure that Vyara will know how to answer.
Thank you. Yes. So I will go back to something that was already mentioned, that basically the guidelines are an interpretation of the law, of the GDPR in this case. That does not change the law itself. But indeed, for the very first time since the creation of the GDPR, we have this black and white rules that come from the supervisors on an EU level on how this should be the GDPR should be interpreted in the context of blockchain infrastructures. So also going back to, has there been any activities by the national data protection authorities on blockchain so far? No, and partially because there were not any guidelines on how this can be interpreted. So I assume that this would at least partially change with the adoption of the guidelines, which is why we are focusing so much on responding to them. Again, deadline 9th of June. If you have any opinions on that, get in touch with us. We are also creating these examples of what is already being built so that we can prove that indeed there are some tools built by the ecosystem that are out there that already grant some level of protection that is beyond encryption and pseudonymity. So we would want this to be acknowledged, and also we would be explaining all the things that we also mentioned during this live, that there might be other ways to go forward while protecting personal data, but without banning the infrastructure itself. So this will be there. But that's just the first step, because again, as mentioned, what truly matters is the text of the GDPR itself, because this is what is then being interpreted. So if we have changes coming in the text of the GDPR that would allow for, say, encryption, ZKP, and similar tech to be acknowledged as something more than just a protection mechanism that ensures some sort of safety but is in itself not enough, then if this is something that is also in the text, that this is also something that acknowledges the current development of the technology, then this would be the real success in this case. And we are quite certain that with now the discussions that are also ongoing, also the European Commission level, that there would be a chance for us to go forward and explain this by using the European Data Protection Board guidelines as also an example of how the other extreme can, in some cases, be really ruinous for all of us, including what the European Union has been trying to build with blockchain as well. So I would say next steps, 9th of June feedback, but then we'll take all this feedback and all these use cases, we as the European Crypto Initiative, and we'll go towards also the discussions of go towards the European Commission and the discussions around the GDPR and the reopening of the GDPR that is also expected, and how those things can be added into the regulation itself.
That's great. So we do, talk about here the GDPR, and it's very related to the European Union. But since the beginning, this project and in a way the blockchain, etc., was global. So that's important for the infrastructure. It's important if we think about the layer ones in a similar way as the internet. It's global. Everyone uses our protocols that everyone is aligned with. So does it go beyond Europe? What are and could be the consequences also for someone that is, for example, from the US or some other activities happening in the UK, Asia, and in other countries? How it is related to anyone that it's outside of the EU?
It goes beyond Europe, territorially speaking, because basically one of the things is that the core thing, it's about the protection of EU citizens. So it doesn't matter where you are. If you are touching EU citizens' data, you need to be compliant with the GDPR. So that's one thing, and something that the European Protection Board is now clarifying when it comes to international transfers is that nodes that are located outside the EU, say in the US, we know that there have been some issues with data transfers with the US, some court cases before, but those nodes might need to be compliant in the GDPR with the GDPR by introducing things like standard contractual clauses and other ways to even have the right to have these data transfers outside the EU. So that's one thing that is quite certain, that is going to be have quite the effect, and goes far beyond the usual, the Brussels effect, the regulations that are multiplying that we're also seeing with the GDPR. But in this case, that would not be the leading factor, because already we have the framework, and now we're starting to interpret also this relationships between validators, nodes, as something that is also within the scope of international transfers. And with a truly decentralized system, it's all about international transfers in this case. So that's
Yeah.
sure.
That's an additional element to see how important these guidance are in a way. So I would thank you very much for this, interview, for being here. We're kind of coming to an end. Of course, if anyone still has any burning questions, we're happy to answer. But just for the last, question from my side, anything that you are excited, about the future. It can be very general. It doesn't have to be, related to this topic, but anything that you're looking forward, and hopefully, it will also in a way become a reality and will be something that we can get excited by as well.
I think
whoever wants to.
I think that there's some real world use cases. I'm speaking to a lot of enterprises, speaking to different entities around the world, and there's some really interesting experiments and real technology being built that'll start to come to life over the next 12 months. And I think that's great to see that blockchain is starting to become more and more realized for its potential. It's not a cure-all, as you said, for some of the marketing messages and things, and that's something I think that slightly holds us back in that image. But I think there's some really good use cases coming out that will continue to surprise the market. And you can see this with some of the enterprises buying some of these companies so they can get a foot in the door, and how they operate. They also start to see some of the value and the technology can enhance their product. And you have to be prepared as a business to rip up some of their business models, because some of their business models are going to get disrupted, and those that hang on to their old business models will be in trouble in this way. Anyway, thanks for your time. It's been great.
Thank you, James.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining, all of you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.